This audio is recorded by JohnLothe. It's intended for educational purposes. If you find value in these works, and if you'd like to assist me in the production of these recordings, head over to my website where you can donate as little as $1 to help me continue making these. I really appreciate all your help. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, JohnLothe. Between Two Ages: America's Role in the Technotronic Era by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Chapter 3. Communism: The Problem of Relevance. Marxism, born of the social upheaval produced by the combined effects of the industrial and nationalist revolutions, provided a unique intellectual tool for understanding and harnessing the fundamental forces of our time. As both a product and a response to a particularly traumatic phase of man's history, it supplied the best available insight into contemporary reality. It infused political action with strong ethical elements. It formed the basis for a sustained attack on antiquated pre-industrial social institutions, and it raised the banner of internationalism in an age increasingly dominated by national hatreds. As the first state to have put Marxist theory into practice, the Soviet Union could have emerged as the standard-bearer of this century's most influential system of thought, and as the social model for resolving the key dilemmas facing modern man. Yet today, Soviet communism is a conservative, bureaucratized doctrine. In China, the scene of the most extensive application of Marxist principles to extreme industrial backwardness, communism is a curious mixture of ethnocentric nationalism and ideological fundamentalism. In the more advanced West, communism is vital only to the extent that it blurs its ideological identity by collaborating with its erstwhile ideological rivals. And in the East, its ideological militancy feeds on a deliberate identification with the most fanatic nationalist passions. In sum, contemporary communism has sacrificed Marx's Promethean commitment to universal humanism. The tragedy of communism, as a universal perspective, is that it came both too early and too late. It was too early to be a source of true internationalism, because mankind was only just awakening to national self-awareness, and because the limited technological means of communication available were not yet ready to reinforce a universal perspective. It came too late for the industrial West, because nationalism and liberal concepts of state reformism preempted its humanist appeal through the nation-state. It came too early for the pre-industrial East, where it served as the ideological alarm clock for the dormant masses, stimulating in them increasingly radical nationalism. Too late in the West, too early in the East. Communism found its moment of opportunity in neither West nor East, but in the halfway house of Russia. Its failures and successes, as well as its specific character, therefore, have to be seen in the context of that peculiar 50-year tie between a would-be universalist doctrine and a highly specific Eurasian national setting. To the present-day world, the practical reality of communism is mainly what Russia has made of it. To modern man, communism in China represents only a potential and does not offer a relevant example. Though some aspects of Chinese communism, its alleged Puritanism, its seemingly permanent revolution, its ideological militancy, may appeal to the more disaffected and emotional Western intellectuals, as a social model, China offers little guidance to those concerned with the problems of advanced industrial civilization. Still struggling with its own backwardness, suffering from political uncertainties, mired in conflicts with its immediate neighbors, increasingly sinifying its Marxism-Leninism. China may be a revolutionary symbol for some, but it hardly offers a blueprint for coping with the social and psychological dilemmas posed by the post-industrial age. To be sure, China may appear in a different light to some of the would-be revolutionary elites in the less developed nations. For some of them, China provides an attractive example of national discipline and ideological dedication. of a massive social effort to modernize in spite of technological backwardness. But even on this level, the Chinese model is relevant only as an example of will and purpose, as a guide to the future, not as an example of how communism responds to the problems of modernity. The experience of the Soviet Union provides the only answer to that crucial test. Part 1. The Stalinist Paradox. One man dominated almost two-thirds of Soviet history, and his name is associated with both a system of rule and a particular approach to constructing communism. No examination of communism's contemporary role in the world, to say nothing of within the Soviet Union, can afford to overlook Stalin's role and Stalin's legacy. That legacy is represented by the Soviet state's current institutions and modes of operation. And even though almost 2 decades have passed since Stalin's death, any Soviet discussion of reform still inevitably revolves around the question of breaking with Stalinism. This is quite understandable. The Soviet state and the Soviet society of today were created by an unprecedented social revolution deliberately carried out by the political elite. Violent and costly, the revolution should not be confused with the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917, for it occurred more than a decade later. During the crucial years of 1930 to 1940, in the course of which Soviet society was reshaped to mirror the ideological aspirations of the political rulers, that revolution consumed at least 6.5 million lives as the new Soviet state took shape. It was that revolution which spawned Soviet Russia's present political elite. It was that revolution which is said to have constructed the first socialist society, based on Marxism, and to have laid the foundations for its eventual entrance into communism. It is also that revolution which begs the question whether that specific character was necessary to assure the industrial development associated so integrally with the creation of the new society. The necessity of Stalinism. The question of the necessity of Stalinism should not be confused with that of its inevitability. In retrospect, inevitability can always be more easily detected in what did happen than in what did not. Stalinism became inevitable because Marxist power first took root in a specific Russian environment, formed by an autocratic political tradition, intellectual frustration, and a strong propensity toward messianism. As a result, certain facets of Marxism were reinforced at the expense of others. It was Lenin's contribution, and the mark of his genius, to have been able to adapt Marxism to his native Russia, and in so doing, to have created both Marxist-Leninist ideology and the Bolshevik Party. Lenin's victory over his rivals within the Russian Marxist movement, and more important, his seizure of power upon the collapse of the old autocratic structure, laid the basis for the successful de-Westernization of Marxism, a victory of Oriental despotic propensities over Occidental democratic tendencies. His emphasis on dogmatic belief, on violence, on conspiratorial activity, and on the almost total subordination of the individual to the party, Partenost, as well as his intolerance of dissent and his paranoid suspiciousness, all to some extent characteristic of Marx's own behavior, both reflected and extended the brutal autocratic tradition in which he operated. It can therefore be argued that Stalin's emergence as top leader, and particularly the Oriental style and mood of his despotism, was facilitated, if not dictated, by Lenin's concept of the party as an elitist group suspicious of the trade union mentality of the workers and hostile to the inertia and conservatism of the peasants. Intolerance of opposition and insistence on obedience to the party facilitated the emergence of a bureaucratically skilled dictator, capable of exploiting these traditions to paralyze would-be opponents and rivals. Writing from entirely different perspectives, Leonard Shapiro and Isaac Deutsche, who certainly did not see eye to eye either on Leninism or Stalinism, Both conveyed the degree to which Leninism made Stalinism possible by inhibiting effective opposition within the party to Stalin's consolidation of power. If Lenin did not make Stalin inevitable, he at least made effective opposition to him within the party impossible. The question of the necessity of Stalinism is, however, a different one. It pertains to the problem of whether Stalinist methods and the resulting Stalinist system were needed to effect the socialist revolution and particularly industrialization. Even if it is assumed that Stalinism, as a political system, was inevitable, it does not follow that the enormous human sacrifice that Stalin extracted from the Soviet people was necessary to modernize and industrialize Russia and the non-Russian nations of the USSR. That sacrifice may have been necessary to preserve the Stalinist system, but to advance that proportion is to shift the ground of the argument and to make the case that to maintain Stalin's power, Stalinist means had to be used. There is no gainsaying that argument. It does not, however, provide an answer to the question whether Stalinist methods had to be used to modernize and industrialize Russia and the non-Russian nations of the Soviet Union. The question is important because the entire edifice of Soviet legitimacy, the authority, and the power of the present Soviet elite is derived from the claim that the past is essentially one of glorious and heroic achievement, only slightly marred by Stalin's occasional misconduct vis-à-vis some of his comrades. Despite the extraordinarily detailed and gory accounts of Stalin's crimes made available to the entire Soviet public during the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1961, the tendency of the post-Khrushchev Soviet leaders has been to minimize Stalin's misdeeds and to stress the accomplishments of the 30s. The implication is that the party acted correctly throughout, and hence that its claim to power is derived from the essentially infallible leadership it has provided, both in the past and in the present. It is on this contention that the present Soviet political system bases its claim to morality and universality. To question the form of the transformation of the Soviet Union is to question the legitimacy of the present rulers, albeit indirectly. Even more, it is to question the international relevance of the Soviet model, and particularly its Leninist-Stalinist concentration of power in the hands of a small, bureaucratic party elite. The events in Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Soviet attacks on the Chinese, Cultural Revolution, because it undermined the primacy of Chinese party officials, and the long-standing Soviet criticism of the Yugoslav dilution of party supremacy, all show the extent to which the Soviet elite still considers its political model to be of broader significance. This link between domestic interests and foreign aspirations explains Soviet sensitivity to suggestions, both by Marxist and non-Marxist scholars, that the Stalinist mode of transforming Soviet society was wasteful, cruel, and, most important, neither outstandingly successful nor necessary. Did Stalin have any alternative? At least some Russians, Marxists as well as non-Marxists, had envisaged means by which Russian industrialization could have been achieved in a manner less physically and morally costly than that pursued by Stalin, though on a comparatively ambitious scale. Even before the 1917 revolution, Russian scholars were drawing up plans for the modernization of their country. Perhaps the most important plan was contained in the study concluded in 1918 by Professor Zbigniew, rector of the Moscow Institute of Technology, which outlined a systematic program to last several decades for development of the country. According to an extremely informative analysis of this study, in addition to providing for deliberate state action, Brzezinski placed greater emphasis than Soviet planners did on price signals and profit criteria as a means by which to arrive, in most cases, at the same priorities, policies, and even specific investment choices as those selected by Soviet planners in disregard of these criteria. Indeed, the top priorities adopted by Soviet planners in the early five-year plans closely matched those envisaged by Brzezinski: electrification, the relocation of industry and population eastward, hydroelectric development, canal construction, and so forth. Though the standard Soviet claim has been that Soviet industrialization was derived from the granite foundations of Marxism-Leninism, there is abundant evidence that Soviet planners, some of them Brzezinski's former colleagues, relied heavily on his work, accepting his targets though rejecting his formula for a more flexible decision-making process and for greater, though not exclusive, reliance on price signals and profit criteria. Within the Communist Party, there was also alternative plans for industrialization, most notably those coming from Bukharin and the so-called right opposition. Somewhat like Brzezinski, they advocated a policy in which positive inducements would be employed to encourage the peasants to increase their production and to make the urban population share some of the social burdens of industrialization, the timetable for which would be somewhat extended. They were particularly opposed to rapid coercive collectivization, the means used by Stalin to extract a surplus from the peasantry, and in that opposition they were later supported, even by Trotsky, who initially had been a strong opponent of Bukharin, most notably those coming from Bukharin, and the so-called right opposition. By 1930, Trotsky had concluded that the physical liquidation of millions of kulaks was an immoral monstrosity, which was initiating a vicious circle of compulsion and violence that was bound to engulf the society as a whole and to discredit communism. Perhaps even more damaging from the Soviet point of view have been the more recent observations of the otherwise orthodox and highly pro-Soviet Polish communist leader Władysław Gomulka. Speaking on November 23, 1961, he similarly labeled collectivization, quote, as the beginning of the process of growing lawlessness, violation of socialist legality, the establishment of an atmosphere of fear, and the growth under these conditions of the personality cult, the cult of Stalin. Closed quote. It should also be noted that Stalinism put an end to a period of unprecedented creativity in Russian architecture, poetry, and the sciences. During the 1920s, in the immediate post-revolutionary phase, Russia exuded a sense of awakened, vibrant energy. The massive terror and the ideological orthodoxy of Stalinism prompted caution and conformity. Even in the ideological realm, Marxist thought was reduced to an intellectually regressive catechism, for which Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism, 1938, served as the all-encompassing frame of reference. A different range of issues is posed by the question whether Soviet development, though morally and physically costly, attained goals unmatched by any other society. This, of course, has special relevance not only to the internal historical legitimacy of the present system, but particularly to its standing as a model for other societies. This claim has been disputed by some Eastern European economic historians, as well as by those in the West. Among the Westerners, Walt Rostow has developed perhaps the most pointed and controversial challenge to Stalinist achievements in modernization. He argues that the communists, quote, inherited an economy that had taken off, close quote, in industrial development in the 2 decades prior to World War I, and that, quote, Stalin was the architect, not of the modernization of a backward country, but of the completion of its modernization, closed quote. Moreover, he sees striking parallels in the pattern and pace of both American and Russian industrialization, the former commencing around the 1860s, and the latter in the 1880s. Similarly, Cyril Black, in his study of Russian modernization, has cited cumulative data showing that, In the perspective of 50 years, the comparative rankings of the USSR in composite economic and social indices per capita has probably not changed significantly. So far as the rather limited available evidence permits a judgment, the USSR has not overtaken or surpassed any country on a per capita basis since 1917, with the possible exception of Italy. And the 19 or 20 countries that rank higher than Russia today in this regard also ranked higher in 1900 and 1919. The per capita gross national product of Italy, which is just below that of the USSR today, was probably somewhat higher 50 years ago. Black's comparisons include countries that, like the Soviet Union, were badly devastated by wars and had to undergo extensive economic recovery. Other students of comparative socioeconomic development have also tried to devise a scheme for ranking countries, and they agree that the Soviet Union today ranks somewhere in the middle 20s. Black is led to the overall conclusion that other societies have achieved similar results at a substantially lower cost, and thus puts into question a major Soviet premise about its own past. Support for these generalizations has also come from a comparative study of growth in steel production as the key aspect of the industrialization process. It should be noted that Soviet economists, as well as political leaders, have frequently relied on steel as the major indicator of Soviet industrial growth. The author of this study, Stefan Kurowski, writing in Communist Poland, offers extraordinarily detailed comparisons showing that, under Stalin, Soviet steel production did not increase at a significantly faster pace than during the more rapid phase of the pre-World War I Russian industrialization, and that these rates approximated those attained by other countries, particularly Japan, during their corresponding phases of rapid industrialization. More generally, relying on a more extensive comparative analysis that involves some dozen countries over the period 1780 to 1970, Kurowski argues that socio-political systems have relatively little to do with the acceleration in the production of steel and iron, and that in the acceleration of production there is a pattern of uniformity due to technical innovation. This conclusion quite naturally provoked official ire, for it touched upon the key issue in the Soviet past. Imperial pacification. Yet, though Stalinism may have been a needless tragedy for both the Russian people and communism as an ideal, there is the intellectually tantalizing possibility that for the world at large it was, as we shall see, a blessing in disguise. As the state possessing the largest and richest landmass, inhabited by pliant yet very creative people, as the carrier of a strong imperial tradition, as a society skilled in warfare and statecraft, with or without Stalin, the USSR was destined to emerge in the front ranks of world powers, with only another continental power, the United States, as its peer. It is thus highly unlikely, given Russia's traditions and the ambitions that the availability of power inescapably stimulate, the post-World War I Russia would have long remained stagnant, mired in a morass of inefficiency. The question that therefore arises is what kind of Russia might otherwise have emerged. A democratic Russia, either liberal or socialist, does not seem to have been a real alternative. It would have required an unprecedented leap from autocracy to democracy, without an intervening period of democratic gestation, and in a setting of enormous social deprivation, dislocation, and confusion. It is difficult to see how post-World War I Russia, torn by nationalist dissension, class conflicts, competing ideological appeals, and sheer physical misery, could have effectively institutionalized a democratic system, when such systems have failed in countries endowed with stronger democratic traditions and functioning under circumstances much more propitious to democratic growth. Given the massive political awakening of the Russian people that had been stimulated by the industrialization of the preceding decades, by the beginnings of literacy, and by the experiences of the war, the only alternative appears to have been an openly chauvinist and intensely imperialist dictatorial regime. When linked with economic expansion, similar phases in the political development of other great nations, Germany, Japan, the United States, resulted in aggressive, dynamic imperialism. Expansive nationalism provided the basis for popular mobilization and for a highly assertive, even aggressive foreign policy. At the very least, Russia, in all probability aided by foreign investments, economic investment in states that subsequently became political enemies, was characteristic of the capitalist era. In all probability aided by foreign investments, economic investment in states that subsequently became political enemies was characteristic of the capitalist era. Led by a modernizing, chauvinist dictatorship, might have experienced a burst of imperialist, nationalist energy that would also have made it a world power, perhaps both at lower domestic cost and in a fashion more threatening to the world. This point deserves some elaboration. Stalin consummated the marriage of Marxism-Leninism and Soviet, particularly Russian, nationalism. The increasing stress on great Russian state traditions, on frontiers, on national aspirations, on Russia's civilizing mission vis-à-vis the non-Russian Soviet nations, and the like, went hand in hand with the physical transformation of the Soviet Communist Party from one dominated by a rather mixed lot of cosmopolitan and internationally oriented intellectuals of Russian, Jewish, Polish, Baltic, and Caucasian origin, into a party dominated primarily by Russian, and to some extent, Ukrainian. Peasants turned partly apparatchiki. To these men, the Soviet political system simultaneously represented the source of their own social advancement and of their political power. Their loyalty to the system was not unlike that of many peasant priests, usually the youngest sons for whom no land was left, to the Catholic Church in traditional societies. It was more institutional than intellectual. Ideology provided the integrative, intellectual perspective, but it was not the principal source of motivation and commitment, as it had been, to the international-minded intelligentsia who preceded them. Accordingly, the new Soviet elite tended to be both conservative and nationalist, even when they sincerely believed themselves to be the advocates of an internationalist ideology. They could thus act in a manner essentially dictated by their own interests, and, nevertheless, consider themselves true internationalists. To them, Stalin's famous dictum that the test of a true internationalist is his loyalty to the Soviet Union was the ideal resolution of the tension that developed between Soviet nationalism and communist internationalism. No wonder that Brezhnev, in effect, revived the dictum in 1968 to explain the occupation of Czechoslovakia. The cumulative result of this situation has been a pattern of mixed motivation and behavior, dominated since Stalin by state considerations that often cynically exploit the ethical universalism of Marxism. But the latter has also had to be kept alive, if only because it mobilized foreign sympathy for the Soviet Union and because it tapped the idealism of Soviet youth, making it easier for the regime to recruit adherents. Though the Soviet Union did exploit its Eastern European vassals, and though its financial and technical aid to China was not politically disinterested, the Soviet people genuinely believe, as they occasionally grumble to visitors, that the Soviet Union has aided both Eastern Europe and China as part of its obligation to communist solidarity. Moreover, the internal violence employed by Stalin and the educational effect of the communist ideology, even if initially not accepted by the masses, had a restraining effect on unbridled nationalism. At first, both Stalinist terror and ideologically induced social change perplexed and often alienated the people. The unprecedented 1936 to 1938 massacre of the top Soviet political, economic, military, and intellectual leadership inevitably reduced the vitality of Soviet society. Literally, several 100,000 of the most talented and best trained people perished during those years. In addition, though the principle of internationalism was often violated in practice, it did restrain the inclination toward great Russian nationalism, if only by forcing more covert behavior. Domestically, that principle helped to preserve non-Russian nationalities, despite Stalin's purges of their intelligentsia. Internationally, it helped to shape in Soviet leaders a state of mind that worked against the incorporation into the Soviet Union of Poland, Finland, and perhaps even other Eastern European states. At one point, the Yugoslavs themselves volunteered for membership in the Soviet Union, and some Slovak communists, including Gustav Husak, proposed the same for Slovakia. This is a temptation that more traditionally nationalist and pan-Slav Russian leaders might have found difficult to resist. Paradoxically, therefore, though Soviet ideology has subsequently been reinforced and perhaps even increasingly dominated by the nationalism of the masses, particularly since World War II, the historical function of Stalinist communism may have been to restrain and redefine a phase in which the Russian people went through an intense nationalist, even imperialist awakening. It forced that new mass nationalism to pay at least lip service to international cooperation, equality of all peoples, and the rejection of racism. Marxism not only provided Russia with a global revolutionary doctrine, but infused it with a universal perspective derived from ethical concerns, not unlike those stimulated in the West by the religious and liberal traditions. Despite its monumental achievements, Stalinism sapped the human and emotional resources of the Russians, and a post-Stalin Russia may therefore eventually enter into the world community as another spent post-imperial power. Finally, by creating a particularly despotic model of communism, and by insisting that all other communist parties submit to it, Stalin not only set in motion the process of fragmenting communism, but also vitiated much of communism's appeal at a time when the susceptibility of the more advanced West, the area originally seen by Marx as ripest for the historical transformation, might have made communism the truly dominant and vital force of our time.